Hi, folks. Welcome to I thought winter was setting in last week, but it's another 70-degree day here in Southern Indiana. So, welcome to Monday's Colloquium here at the workshop. Nice to see all these good folks, and I think we've got quite a few people online as well. So, welcome to those folks that are there, and want to invite or want to welcome Caroline Brock. Luckily, she accepted our invitation to come today. She's from the University of Missouri in Columbia, and she's our colloquium speaker today. She's an associate teaching professor at the university there in the sociology department, and her work has been fascinating to me. I've been studying and reading your work for several years now, and actually was hoping that we finally got to meet now that we sort of were working together during COVID, and so it's our first time in person at the same place. But she's workshopping her paper today entitled Amish and non-Amish Farmer Perspectives on Climate Change Effects, Causes and Adaptation Strategies. And this work was done with Ryan Hayden at the Ohio State University up in Worcester. And Caroline's research background is really interesting. There's three complementary categories. It's about understanding the gaps and complementarities between scientific and agriculture practitioner knowledge. Also, number two is farmer decision-making around conservation, alternative practices. And then the third being diversity and inclusion in formal and non-formal education settings, with focus on Amish and Mennonite communities, sort of tying it all together. So I'm sure you're going to give a little more intro than that, but thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you. And then when it's time, we'll have we'll do the moderation and make sure everybody online is able to participate well. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you. It's a real delight and pleasure to be here. As James mentioned, I am full-time teaching faculty right now, so it's a big delight and pleasure to be able to talk about research and not be grading papers. So thank you for that opportunity. So yeah, just kind of building on the background that James just gave you a little bit of overview, but I really enjoy working with on interdisciplinary projects, particularly with natural and physical scientists, to kind of bring the social dimension and to be able to, because those complementary pieces can be so helpful. And then particularly those complementary places can be very helpful when we're trying to figure out gaps in understanding between practitioners, namely farmers, and those working in the field, those doing the scientific practice on the academic side, as well as those doing in extension and the private sector working with farmers. And then to that end too, very helpful to think about how we do education and outreach, not only in the classroom, but in the outside of the classroom sector. So some of my more recent endeavors before I launch into the project that I'm going to spend the majority of the time talking about today, and hopefully getting some feedback from all of you, is thinking about particularly plain farmers is the way that I've sort of thought about it more recently, many of these dimensions. And so plain farmers are folks that have some kind of distinctive practice based at the church level in terms of dress or in terms of technology. And so so some of the examples of some recent endeavors, this is my most recent publication that came out in the summer, looking at plain, i.e. Those folks that I just mentioned, Amish and Mennonite, and how they practice managing their dairy herd health. And so looking at antibiotic remedies in particular, or antibiotic use, and then natural remedies in particular, and mostly looking at the dairy cattle, but we also dove a little bit into as much as was comfortable with their own family health as well, and finding that there were some unique practices that were utilized that were sort of in the middle. We called it a third way between organic and conventional. And so that was kind of the more recent. And then I also did a number of other projects collaborating with some people at Ohio State. I went on a research leave for a year and a half. And so I published a number of things about, again, organic dairy. Well, this was organic dairy herd health. And then also soil health was another area, particularly where there was interesting disconnects between what farmers were doing and what the soil scientists were recommending in terms of soil fertility practices. And so after kind of squeezing out all that I possibly could in terms of publications, I've been more recently kind of helping other folks along, helping them get things written up. So there is this kind of issue that seems like in academia where there's big incentives, right, to start new projects and birth new projects, as I would call it, and they don't necessarily get all written up and published so that other people can enjoy and utilize them. So my first project at trying to do that is working with person, Ryan Hayden, who had some data on Amish and non-Amish producers. And so that was collected quite some time ago, and he actually got in later in on the project and then was like, it's just sitting here, right? Like, can you help me write it up? And so finding that there's a number of folks that have that same situation, right, where they have things, but they haven't been necessarily written up in a way that other people can actually utilize them. So in that context, climate change was the main thing that they were trying to look at with both Amish and non-Amish farmers in Ohio. And as many of you know, because you may be doing research on this, I'm learning more and more. Some of the research that's been done here on this, but climate change is something that, while the vast majority of the public believes that there's some extent is happening, with farmers, particularly the human-caused connection is more of a tension, and there tends to be less farmers than we might think that would actually be on board with that idea, particularly in the Midwest. So that anthropogenic connection is particularly in the minority. However, to some extent, we see more of a connection with extreme weather events. However, we don't see that as much of a connection or a concern in the Midwest with those connections with weather events. So we know very little about the Amish in these perspectives. There's been a little bit that has been done on it, more conversational. And so why might wonder, why would somebody like myself spend so much time studying the Amish, this particular project and other ones? This is actually just a snapshot from a conversation that I had with my colleague that we were doing interviews, as I mentioned earlier, about antibiotics and natural remedies. And farmers, like farmers are inclined to do, like all people, have a sense of humor, particularly about academics. And so this farmer was explaining what he was doing with his farm and with regards to antibiotic use and such like that. And he said, well, what I'm doing is almost as crazy as people going to the university to study the Amish. And so, like we're, writing down notes furiously because we're not using digital recorders. And then we're like, whoa, stole a joke on us. And so I think it's a good question, right? Like, I've had this conversation before, like, why are you even interested in us? Like, what's so special about us, right? We're just people, we're just farmers, we just do the things that we do, like everyone else. So to that question, why focus on the Amish? Well, for one thing, Amish plain folks doubling in population every 20 years. And if you're someone interested in rural landscape issues, things that are happening there, there's clearly something there to be studied, particularly with farming. As more and more people leave, there are more and more fraction, at least of the smaller scale farmers, that the Amish folks and conservative Mennonite folks are taking up. We can see some less labor, less debt costs and things like that. So there's certainly some advantages there. And long-term dedication to a rural lifestyle that is very much connected to their identity as well. So we can see some tensions though more recently, even for the Amish and Mennonites. And then if we think about who they are, right, even though most outsiders often just define them by their technology use or not using certain things, right, and can get them into kind of quandaries as to what those means. But really, if we ask the Amish, many of them, at least that I've talked to, think of themselves as a denomination of Christianity, right, in this broader umbrella known as the Anabaptist, all right, that branched off in the Protestant Reformation period, in part because of adult baptism, because they wanted to have some real clear distinction between the Catholic state church at the time and their own communities of believers interpreting the scripture, right, at a local level, what that means. And so we can see over time, right, this is the 16th century, and then the Amish and the Mennonites kind of subsequently kind of broke off from one another. But we can see this larger tent where we see Amish and Mennonite or other related groups. And the Old Order Amish is generally who we're talking about when we talk about agricultural issues. But there are some other groups that also are important players. So the Old Order Amish is just that one little slice there, which you may be able to see. Don't worry too much about the colors, but the colors basically mean, in big picture terms, is that they use horse and buggy for local transportation. And in the case of the Order Amish, most of them use horses for farming, significantly away from the barn. That's probably the easiest way to say it. And so then we have a few more conservative Mennonite groups. That also may be in the same playing field in the smaller to mid-sized farm. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there's not a lot known about Amish when it comes to stewardship. There are a number of writers out there though, that wax very poetically about their potential, right? And I think to some degree we can see the connection certainly with some of the more diversified and small scale ways that they farm. And so there have been a few academics, not a lot of academics, that have been looking at creation care connections with the Amish. And we see that, and we see that for the most part, more broadly, what we can say about them is that they may identify, not surprisingly, with a kind of biblical stewardship idea, which some of you are kind of looking at that more broadly, even beyond the Amish, rather than how we might sort of think about environmentalism per se. And so we can see some possible benefits for the way that some of these more conservative groups are farming, in part because they tend to be more diversified, more small scale, and we can see some benefits to that. And of itself, they are known historically, so there's long-term history of being very good soil conservation, very good in their soil conservation practices, even in European history before they came to the US. They had a reputation for being innovators in that way. Just kind of a brief of where they actually are. This gives you some sense of where they are. So the more highly concentrated areas are the dark green. So you can see in Indiana, you have some of those in the northern areas, but you even have some green areas closer to where we are here right now. Okay, so I think I went over that. So characterizing and comparing Amish and non-Amish observations, as well as local weather changes and climate change ideas and impacts with non-Amish farmers. It's kind of what we're doing here. And we're honing in right now in a particular area of Ohio where there is big Amish concentration. Wayne and Holmes County, Ohio. So there's a large very large settlement, Holmes County, Old Order Amish right there. And so this was a survey that was conducted, like, as I said, a while ago, 2014. It was spearheaded by a professor who did a lot of interesting projects, some of them very practical, and a lot of times he didn't actually write them up. So this is just kind of one of those. I think he probably has a number of other things that have not been written out to yet be discovered and learned about. And so we can see the demographics from this particular survey, not surprising, All right, majority male respondents, less formal education. This was can also be kind of as a proxy. We may do that with some of the work that's been done here, is the formal education, because especially the old order Amish cease to continue formal education after the 8th grade. That's how it can kind of be almost a proxy for Amish or not. Tend to be younger, more reliant, less reliant on farm income, and then more diversified, as we said earlier, not surprisingly, with more vegetable production and stuff like that. So the results. So we can see here that we have truly low levels of belief in climate change, particularly in the human connection with climate change. And we can see that it is lower still for the Amish. And so yeah, particularly that human cause, we can see that that is significantly different as well. And then another interesting thing to point out here is that we get more of the Amish farmers talking, selecting other, right? So, hey, I'm going to bypass all of these kind of pre-selected answers, and 18% of them versus 8, which I think was interesting, decided to not check any of those boxes. And then when we come to climate related impacts, which we kind of conjectured would be a little less charged, right? Less connected with some of those climate change kind of baggage that we have in the political landscape. We still see low levels of concern on this one, because we asked about levels of concern in this particular one. And so we can see not concerned is 1, somewhat concerned is 2. And so we can see that the averages are kind of somewhere in between for most of these: severity of winter weather, flooding events, arrival of planting season, which in Ohio, right, flooding events, early spring flooding events, some of the work that I've seen that some folks have done more recently, like if we're going to be concerned about something in the Midwest, that might be it. But however, we're more concerned, it looks like, about government regulations, which you can see that's bordering between concerned and very concerned, and more concerned about energy costs. And there's no significant difference between the Amish and the non-Amish in those particular categories. And if we look at climate related impacts, and we think about global versus more to your farm, all right, we can also see that not a lot of concern there. There's a little bit more concern with the non-Amish about climate changing having more harm than benefit to me globally. Same thing with kind of looking at the farm to me, right, rather than global. Same thing where we don't have an extreme level of concern, but it's still going to be more for the non-Amish. And then if we look at level of productivity will be negatively impacted. We also see that some of them are significantly different, the future winters and the flooding, but overall still fairly low level of concern there, particularly less so for the Amish. And then if you look at ability to adapt, we see that the Amish and the non-Amish, there is some significant differences. We're not quite sure how to interpret some of these things. So by the way, any of these things we can kind of interpret together. And certainly looking at winter weather being more severe, or the planting season arriving earlier, and then flooding events was that we asked about. And then without government involvement, so bringing back the government involvement connection, we see that they're fairly confident that they would rather, right, adapt without government intervention. And so we can see some high numbers here, higher numbers. So we're getting more into the agree, right, strongly. Well, yeah, agree probably is probably the best thing, but almost strongly disagree or agree. Certainly when we talk about the second one, I'd rather personally adapt to the effects of climate change than adhere to new government policies. And then relatedly, right, looking at the support for possible policy changes, then we're kind of back in the right disagree to neutral categories there. And in terms of positive effect that it will have, we've got certainly disagree somewhat right to neutral. And more risk to your farm, right, than the climate change itself is clearly something that they're concerned about. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so more interesting to me actually than these survey responses is the open-ended. So I wish there was more open-ended. I'm more of an interview person, but this is just one example of some quotes. Certainly could find some more from the paper that give you some interesting connections that we sort of see that some of the farmers are making between kind of their religious worldview and their ideas about climate change. So this quote says, sadly, the excitement about global warming, climate change, along with most of modern science, right, largely denies God's supernatural power in creating the universe. So there's this idea that, you know, the weather, climate is kind of this supernatural, more divine place, and it's not, it's kind of almost, yeah, it's too much for us to assume that humans would have some kind of impact on this. And we see, you know, probably more of these comments. Yeah, there is more of these comments coming from the Amish, but we actually see some of these kind of comments coming from the non-Amish as well, right? Informed from the same kind of biblical worldview. So again, kind of climate's in God's domain, right? And I think we're seeing that also for some of the non-Amish as well. And we can definitely see, right, no big surprise, but maybe even more profound than we might have conjectured even before, right? That there's this kind of lack of trust in the state and science institutions. So take home points, and then I've got, you know, some different germs of ideas for future research and outreach. That's kind of that I'd love to have some discussion with you all about. So relatively low levels of belief in climate change, especially the human caused connection. And that is particularly profound, right, with the Amish. Low levels of concern about climate change and weather-related impacts. We kind of thought weather-related impacts would have more of an effect, more of a concern than did. And so when we looked at the open-ended comments, forgot to mention this earlier, besides kind of that religious connection, we also saw that if they commented on weather-related events, it was very much isolated weather events, all right? Not necessarily connecting it to a trend. So isolated weather events, those were kind of more relatable, certainly, and those were what were discussed. And so this connection with religious ideals is certainly something that I think is underexplored in the literature that I think the Amish just give kind of voice to, but likely is clearly happening on connecting with the larger things that may be happening with other farmers, certainly. So climate change attitudes and behaviors should be studied in the context of broader values, right? Especially religious ones going forward. Interviews, I think, would be particularly more helpful to kind of unpack some of this survey data that's a bit hard to interpret. And especially if you look at different locations that might have more extreme weather events going on, because we do see in the literature, certainly like in California and such like that, where more extreme weather events are more kind of profound, the farmers are able to connect a bit more, right, than they were, at least at the time that this was done in the Midwest. And then also kind of looking at some of the literature that I'm kind of trying to incorporate here as we speak, that there may be more connections for opportunity. So we just asked about government, like attitudes towards government policy more broadly, right? And so of course it would be much more helpful to be looking at like, well, different kinds of government policies and such like that, and having a conversation, because certainly the literature, at least, it says, you know, like maybe not surprisingly, right? If it's framed more as an opportunity rather than increased regulation, right, is more of a positive thing, then possibly there may be some more openings there. And then also even the way that things were asked, it looks like, you know, if you look at other surveys that have been done, this idea of concern and then asking about adaptation, like maybe we need to uncouple that, because like we may be getting a connector, right, between as they go throughout the survey, how they're answering these things. So to be able to kind of split those apart and be able to ask about each of those ideas independently, I think would be helpful. And then sort of thinking about their broader connections, right? Like the broader things that they're thinking about, the economics and all of these different pieces, to be able to kind of understand that and see to what degree they are making these connections. I think conversations are certainly going to be helpful for that. So clearly there are negative attitudes, and hopefully we can kind of explore that more with different possible ways that government could be involved, but also thinking about public-private partnerships that could potentially happen, certainly because the Amish in particular can be challenged to work with them with government policies alone. We already know that because cost share type arrangements in the conservation realm don't really work for the Amish, partly because of that kind of connection with the government and taking money from the government, and they're more focused on individuals rather than like church community level focus. So kind of thinking more creatively about these and capitalizing on the ones that have been done, as alluded to earlier. Some of those have been written about, but I think there's some things that have been done that we have yet to kind of document and fully learn from. And then think about the kinds of practices that we already know farmers are interested in, particularly Amish farmers are interested in more broadly learning about soil health and soil biology. We know that, but particularly from the Amish, we have a lot of them doing organic farming and cover cropping, and in the Midwest, certainly in certain sectors, they are the primary players in some of those sectors. So learning more from that and the connections that might be made with climate-friendly practices. And so also more collective effort, certainly on the part of academics. As I was learning to earlier, they were kind of all out here doing our own thing. And I think there could be a lot more done to make sure that we're not competing on the same landscape, but kind of learning from each other, and the things that have already been done that need to be written up, but also the things that we plan to do in the future. So I think that's, yeah. Hopefully that's a good starting place for some conversation.
Sorry, I got yeah, I had to manage from that computer over there, but well, like in true colloquium fashion, we'd like to see if a grad student would like to start us off with the first question.
We can monitor the chat too, James. You don't have to worry about
Yeah,
it.
thank you.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I feel like we've discussed this in the past, but it's just very interesting to try to parse out the influence of like the term climate change and the impact of the survey, because you know, I noticed that there is like a question that just talks about weather patterns, and it's like a much higher value than the other ones. But it's also, I would expect, maybe dragged down by the fact that we had talked about, or at least, sorry, that like your data had talked about climate change previously.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that we organize the presentation for you all is flipped from the survey. So yeah, I think the climate change stuff, I'm pretty sure it came later because they were somewhat aware of this, albeit, yeah, like they couldn't capitalize on some of the things that were learned more recently about some of this research, which at least I can, certainly in the discussion. But yeah, they were aware at least that was going to create a negative bias. So it was framed later, but nevertheless, like, yeah, they may not be going linearly in the survey. So I think it's a fair point. Yeah, for sure.
A similar thing is, so I went to college in Worcester. So
Oh, you did? College of Worcester or the?
College of Worcester, but I worked at the Ag Institute. So
You did. Nice.
but like one of the things that I just kind of absorbed there is that the Amish folks in that area, I think they have a different definition of like science in comparison to like local researchers. So and that's kind of where I don't quite like the framing of this, because I think the general public kind of has like a different definition of scientists versus the Amish, and then the Amish have like different definitions of science versus like the Ohio State folks that they know and have been there, you know, as long as they have.
Yeah. Yeah, do you have any particular examples? I probably could give some myself, but
No,
yeah.
I don't, but I just like
Are
kind
you-
of wonder if you would, like, it goes back to this, like, how do they define climate change?
Yeah,
And like, are there these varying definitions?
yeah, that's a good point. It could be unpacked, yeah, further with interviews for sure. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, at least the work that I did on like the soil fertility, soil balancing, I guess would have definitely kind of illuminated those different ideas about science and like what are the objectives of a certain thing, and it might be like topic specific what they might think the objective of that is, but that would be a really great thing to further unpack for sure. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for this. I especially like the sort of illuminating understudied populations. And so nearby, I actually just spent last weekend at an Amish wedding. Just
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So
To ask you more about
yeah, so
that.
this is really some friends of ours down there. So I have a few questions about sort of the sampling and stuff. So you ended up with a relatively small sample in the end. Having started with about 700, it sounds like, and that's actually still a pretty good response rate, frankly, right? Especially for like a mail-in survey and then also a survey to a population that is largely removed from. So so I guess one question is, so my first question is, do you have a sense of who was likely to respond and whether that shapes the population you're looking at, right? Is there any reason to believe that they're fundamentally different than the people that didn't respond? And that gets to the larger question of that, the fact that like, yes, you note some differences between the Amish and non-Amish, but they're not that great. And I was curious about whether you have a sense of, you know a lot about from really wonderful work, I'm blanking on her name, about sort of rural politics and sort of surveys about government in rural regions and how fundamentally, on average, across this country,
Yeah,
they generally don't like government intervention.
right.
This is, I would assume, to be especially true in places like Ohio, in rural Ohio. And so I guess one of the questions I have is whether you have a sense of, either given your other work or what other scholars have done, whether some of these findings are essentially not necessarily unique to Amish versus non-Amish, not even maybe unique to farmers, frankly.
Yeah.
And sort of how you're thinking about that, especially because one of the things that's kind of interesting is, in the end, you convinced me that sort of studying the Amish is important also because if there are people that may be skeptical of whatever version or definition of climate change you come up with, thinking about other cultural approaches might be very helpful. But it was especially interesting because you said they're already actually very good at organic farming and soil conservation and things that suggest that education or changing minds or whatever we would want to think about, trying to sort of think about how climate change factors into people's decision making, that population may not actually be that important in that regard because they're already doing lots of different things that mean that they are improving their environment in ways that people outside of this community are not. So I was sort of trying to play a little devil advocate there, sort of thinking about the sort of how we think about what we're learning from this population.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. Yeah, and I don't know, like back to the survey, there's a couple of questions, I guess, embedded in what you just said, but yeah, like the one was like if they're, I do think, and I think I put it in the paper, but I didn't put it here, that it's very reflective of the like greater politics certainly of this particular region for sure. That it's not necessarily, because it's like low just in general on a lot of those questions. So yeah, but I don't know necessarily if there's any particularities with the people that responded. I'm not sure. I feel like that I would have a better sense with some of the other projects that I've been involved in. Yeah, that one. Then I forgot what.
Oh, I had sort of had a question about whether, like, given the numbers are quite similar, like, so you said that they expect to be sort of reflective of the sort of region. I'm just curious.
Yeah, it was lower than I thought.
Quite a difference between these two populations if you're looking somewhere where the baseline was not so skeptical.
Yes, that would be a good thing to do. Yeah, and then in some respects, they are doing some climate friendly practices and maybe not necessarily in all respects for sure, but that's a good launching off point of what they're doing well at. So that could be a conversation for sure in a more positive way then. Yeah, for sure. So that is a possibility, I feel like too.
I know we had one question online. Bernie Fisher asked a question. I'm paraphrasing, but this survey was in 2014. Is there any conversation with Ryan about doing a follow-up to look at change over time?
Well, the conversation follow-up has been with people in this room actually about doing, possibles. Yeah, because we actually, I mean, I wasn't there, maybe also with the awkwardness of the sampling as I wasn't there for that. I started it, that's the fostering. But yeah, I'm gonna probably foster some stuff that was birthed here as well. But yeah, that's the hope of collaborating. Yeah, definitely beyond the start of it. Sure. Yeah, so other people are interested.
And then I've got a follow-up question. That's my question. So from what I gather, a major major writer on sort of environmentalism amongst the Amish population is David Klein.
Yes.
Does he live in Wayne County or Holmes? So I was surprised. Even with David Klein, like for those of you that aren't aware, like I mean, he like, and when I've heard him speak on podcasts and stuff, very much talking about climate change and environment. Am I correct in that?
He uses the word climate change. I don't know. It's a good question, but yeah, he definitely talks about like stewardship and such like that. Yeah, and I've had some great conversations. And his son's really active in Organic Valley, and he's been involved in some research projects that I've been involved with as well. So,
and then to have is like 0% of the respondents that are Amish say that climate change is like anywhere human anthropogenically related. I was like, I figured at least like somebody, like one.
Right. No, and I don't get that sense in the like broader like organic population, the non-Amish organic population that would be the case. I don't know that there's been any studies done on farmers in the Midwest, but just talking to farmers that are organic, I think more of them are on board with it that are not Amish for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I could at least anecdotally. Yeah.
I've got to jump over here.
Yeah,
Joel.
Yeah.
Oh, hi. Could you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. I was wondering if you had done any analysis or specifically extended your survey to like church elders in the Amish church, like the bishop or the deacons. Because they will often set the bylaws of what the Amish, their local community, can do and recommendations, like in terms of driving cars, using electricity, when and where they can use motorized vehicles, such like that, as well as the other hand, the extension agents. Have you looked into what the extension agents' beliefs are around this? Because they also would have quite an impact, I think.
Yes, that's a great question. I haven't for this project, but for other projects, yeah. Interestingly, the whole church leader dynamic with the Amish, I feel like it's hard to say like a recipe book about the best strategy, to kind of figure out these sort of dimensions or unravel these sorts of queries, because the leaders will make decisions about certain elements of the Amish, certainly regulations around bicycles and things like that. But with regard, there's a lot of space that doesn't fall within that preview, that are necessarily like concrete decisions about whether they do or they don't. There's a lot of yeah, I guess gray is maybe the best way to say it, or unspoken. And so sometimes it's a good idea to meet with the leaders about things, but sometimes it's better to just ask the members, and it's hard to kind of, big conversation because I don't always know, but because I've kind of done both. But this one was, just sent straight to the folks. And sometimes it's not necessarily the bishops, though. It might be like I was just talking about David Klein's son. It could be like leaders that are in the kind of ag realm as well, but maybe not a church leader, that can be helpful to kind of connect with those. But yeah, I think it would be really important going forward in any project looking at climate change friendly practices to talk to extension agents, to talk to these private, because like certainly in the soil health realm I was talking about earlier, like farmers are really looking not just at extension agents, but they're looking at different private sector folks for information on really important factors of their farm. So definitely not to be discounted.
We've had a couple more questions coming online. Sorry, Joel.
Oh, I just said thanks.
Yeah.
Gotcha. This one comes from a person entitled The Old Man. Not sure who it is.
Sorry, I got logged out a bunch of times. I just typed in the old man finally.
Okay, so you're the one that I couldn't mute. So I'm wondering, or go ahead. Yeah.
What was I overheard to have asked? Oh yeah, so I was thinking about the decline of family farming in general in the US.
Yeah.
And possibly even worldwide, and the rise of industrial farming. And if you've done any study of the same in non-Amish community compared to that. And I almost wondered why, listening to you, whether are the last family farms the Amish? Or is that a kind of interesting exaggeration, but to some degree true?
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's this kind of whole bifurcation with the really small, right, and the big get big. And so, yeah, definitely, I think the Amish and some conservative Mennonites are definitely filling that smaller space for sure in that landscape. Yeah, and I think, yeah, I mean, and they, at least some of the Amish that I've talked to, you know, like are not are concerned about like big ag and such like that, so they can get on board with those critiques. So, yeah.
I'm also wondering, as almost a follow-up, to what extent regulatory changes are involved? Because I'm thinking, I spent 20 years in North Carolina, during which the Republicans basically got rid of the old laws that said you couldn't farm more than 5 acres of tobacco at a time or something like that. As soon as they got rid of that, industrial farming kind of took over tobacco, cotton, and everything else in North Carolina. And migrant labor came in, and then it complains about the immigrants. But I'm wondering whether the regulatory changes favor Amish farming practices.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot we could say there. I mean, most recently, there's been a lot of discussion about like food safety, certainly with the vegetable realm. And so lots of discussions on trying to adapt and such like that. And some Amish people, I think, including David Klein, like were, you know, a part of some of those conversations of how they're going to adapt, because some of the concerns were like contact with manure. Well, if you farm with horses, how are you not going to have some contact with manure, right? With the vegetables and such like that. So yeah, that would be just one example. It's fascinating, but the great case where, yeah, probably more could be learned from those conversations and how they were able to come up with some of those compromises. Yeah. Mhm.
So we have another online, then we're gonna go to Jack's, but Annie Shattuck online says, I was interested that Amish were even more likely to depend on off-farm income than non-Amish responded. How do you think the level of dependence on farm income affects how people perceive adaptation? I had that exact same question, so close enough, but so how do you perceive, or how do you think the level of dependence on farm income affects how people perceive adaptation? And going off of the statistic where they were less dependent on farm income than not.
That's a great question. I probably should give more time to that one. So the idea is why they might be or less confident about adaptation related to diversification.
Yeah, and I mean, inside of the fact that the Amish were less reliant on farm income than their English counterparts or their non-Amish counterparts. And then, is there any relation with that? And then, you know, with the...
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess in my other research, it seemed like there was a time issue with like conservation projects, you know, because like, just like to illustrate, like some of the farmers would be so diversified that they'd be like doing construction during the day, and it might be like, you know, having to get carpool there for like an hour and a half to the construction site, and then they come home at 6 o'clock at night, and then they'd have their farm to manage, and it's like, how are they gonna, you know, add some conservation practices onto that? So like there's an element, but there could be also a flip side of more flexibility because they're not as reliant on it. I don't know, like probably some further explanation there or further exploration there for sure. Yeah, that's a great question.
Oh, Jackson.
There are some areas in the list. Yeah. No, keep going.
Jackson, Gustavo.
Yeah, Caroline, I appreciate one of your findings was the need for some qualitative data. And there was one area where I found intriguing with this issue of seeing things, individual events versus trends. And following up on that with some questions about
Mhm.
like, what would it mean to go to make this a trend? And curious, like whether that's intensity, frequency, duration type of issue, or is access to information? And if there's a difference between these two groups and that where one is more, doesn't matter what information is provided versus access to information.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know my colleague, Ryan Hayden, I think is kind of intrigued, may not be doing full justice, but like to the idea of having a conversation of like looking at the data with the farmers and kind of having a discussion about their, observations and like, events that they're thinking about, and then looking at the broader scope of the data for sure. Yeah, and how they might interpret that.
Gustavo?
Okay, very, very interesting. It's not a paper, it's more like a research agenda.
Yeah, it is more than that. Yeah.
So a couple of comments. So the first one is so I was trying to figure out exactly, because this is not about climate change, because it's like the Amish community could switch to like full environmental friendly to be polluting all day, and this will not make any change in the climate, no? So essentially, this is more about learning about how different groups accept, belief, react to the notion of climate change. So it's a project about belief formation at the end, no? So I would think that it would be interesting more to focus on that, okay? And then like a second idea related to that is, well, what type of conservation issues are we talking about? Are we talking about something that is good for your farm, or it's something that is good for to fight global warming, but I am paying a cost at the individual level? Because these are two very different things, no? So, and I think most of the time what is happening is that essentially we are coming with, well, it's the same thing if we go to, any sector and you are asking for, do you agree with this regulation that will force you to increase costs? Well, they're always against those. Essentially, you're trying to fix an externality, but then the problem is there. So I think that could be something interesting to play around. It's, is there any room for things that are good for the environment, but good for your farm? Or we are just asking these guys, well, pay some cost that benefit everybody, but you pay the cost. So that's a very different thing. And then final comment about the survey, it's what about so different people, they maybe have different willingness to lie or to do not reveal the truth. What about if the Amish are just like a true type farmer that really tells you what they really believe, and some of the other guys, they're just hiding because they know that people in academia, they like environment. So sometimes they just want to go with you, essentially. And then what we are getting from the farm with the Amish is what a real truthful farmers think about these things.
So just to recapitulate, if you don't mind, the first point was kind of like, because the Amish are maybe not taking up a big footprint on the land, that maybe they're not making a big impact in terms of climate change. So it's more of a people discussion about people's ideas. Okay. And so to that point, we should be focusing more on the.
Yes, I don't know. I was thinking about the project, how to focus it, and then it seems it's more about the local communities and how they form belief. And then this could apply to other things, not only about other government regulations, other
farmers,
education policy, and you can learn more rather than specifically about
just the Amish, for sure. Yeah, I think that's important. Yeah. Thank you.
Jay?
I have some question about how they govern their knowledge commons. Looks like they have different in the perspective of philosophy of science. I believe that all of the institutional arrangement they did might be different.
Mhm.
from the other non-Amish production or something. My question is, did you find something about what they did to pass that knowledge to the next generation of Amish farmers?
Oh, yeah, not from this survey research, but at least like maybe maybe to your point about like a little bit different their perspective on science or the state, maybe I could maybe broaden it to that. I don't know that it's necessarily true in this particular area, but I do have the sense that maybe the resistance to working with the state is less like the standard conservative kind of narrative around that. Because like, for instance, they don't as in general, like take like cost share program or insurance payouts and such like that as much as non-Amish farmers, as much as they say they don't want to, right? They don't believe in government intervening and such like that. They certainly do work with the government, right? But they don't necessarily celebrate it, but they do. Whereas the Amish will more kind of consistently try to pull out. And so I think, so to that end, and because of their unique ways that they selectively use technologies, like there are some examples of collective strategies that have been useful, like for instance, like conservation district might work with a particular Amish group that collectively owns a like a no-till driller that they can retrofit to a horse and such like that. So it's like a collective ownership of a piece of equipment. That would be an example of a more collective way of navigating something like that.
Did you
Is that
find
kind of
something like Amish agricultural learning center or something?
Nothing that concrete, but I guess maybe what would be somewhat of a learning collective is like Organic Valley, which is in like this particular area is mostly Amish people, and they meet together and exchange ideas about how to do things, and actually kind of to that end. Well, this is in Organic Valley, but was it this one? Yeah, like this is actually a picture of organic farmer and like yeah, like kind of going to each other's farms and learning from each other. And so like this is a diversified cover cropping, which I think is like 12 species, and you can see like they're fascinated, like gravitate towards things like that and having discussions. And so yeah, there's definitely some of that going on. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Go for it. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. I think the age-old religion versus science debate
Yes.
is quite reflected, and religion takes precedence here over science.
Uh-huh.
Now, when we are moving ahead on the frontiers of technology, particularly artificial intelligence, let us forget the climate part where they are trying to deny or possibly, not trying to accept the climate change and but if you look at even the weather prediction has, significantly improved using AI across the world. I see in my geography, I see in nearby geographies. I'm from India. So, and the farmers there have been very receptive to the AI-based, weather predictions because they are coming almost close to perfection. So, do you think, the same farmers would be receptive to something like this, the precise weather prediction, because it definitely helps them in their farming, and that is a way to get them motivated towards understanding that, techniques around agriculture that are evolving now, considering the impact on climate and usage of technology is a better way to reach out to them. I don't intend to say that we need to reach out to them, but this is a way to orient them to the realities of time.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with some of those developments, but yeah, I would think if they had some level of understanding, particularly the Amish people, like if they had some level of understanding of how that AI was like developed and such like that, then I could see them being on board with that. I don't think they would necessarily say it's verboten. Yeah, like yeah, sometimes it's surprising the things that they know about things like that, for sure. Yeah.
Any final questions? Anne?
Yeah, thank you. This is really cool, very fascinating. I'm really fascinated by this idea that the Amish have, I mean, it seems that they have a particular cosmology, right? They've got this ontology of the world that says that climate is not their domain. This is God's domain. But it's clear that they don't necessarily think that about land, right? Land is still God's domain, but land is something that's there for them to use. There's this responsibility to be a steward of that land. And I'm wondering if this is, where's the line, right? Where do we go out of Earth and then into the climate that's God's realm? Right? Are you uncovering some kind of Amish cosmology?
Yeah, that may be reflective, I guess, to this gentleman's point, like of something maybe, yeah, broader that's happening, yeah, for sure, with other farmers as well. Yeah, yeah, there's maybe something there. Like I hadn't connected the land versus the weather, but yeah, it's an interesting way of framing it.
Your response rate amongst Amish, I don't have my computer in front of me, and I don't know, do you have broken down, this is more of a methodological question, because I had the benefit once of, when I was working on a project, collaborating with Purdue Extension, and they've been awesome to collaborate with, and there was with the Amish population that got our survey, it was real small, up in like the Fort Wayne region, like 12 people got the survey and all 12 responded, but it was handed to them by an extension educator from Purdue Extension. And so it's like, boom, they all came, I was like, how is that possible? I was like, because everybody else, it's like, 20%. And so do you find that Amish farmers are more likely to respond and engage in research than non-Amish farmers?
Oh, yes, it can go either way. It's all based on these like relationships, as you said, or this like, feeling that there's some kind of connection that they're supposed to do it. Like for my dissertation, I got a higher response rate for the Amish, and it may be like maybe a false notion on their part, but like we worked with the kind of Amish owned cooperative dairy cheese creamery. And so like we worked with the folks so that they actually delivered it with their milk check. And I think they thought there was a connection. Bless their hearts, there wasn't. But like we got a really good response rate. So yeah, and I think too, like the work that I've done like on extension agents and conservation agents, like they don't even think of them as extension agents. They think of it as Bob, and if Bob hands them the survey, yeah, you're gonna get a lot better response rate if they like Bob. So
okay,
yeah,
I was like, I never before I had seen that. I mean, it's a small insight, but still.
And I think it's somewhat reflective of non-Amish people, but way more, I think more in the relational dimension for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we can wrap things up there. Thank you so much for being here, from coming over from Columbia and Columbia, Missouri, that is. Appreciate it.
That sounded more exciting.
And folks, I know there's some food next in the room next door, so please stick around, but thank you. Thanks for the people online for showing up today. Hope you all enjoyed it, and we'll sign off.
Yeah.
Thank you.